The town spat her out like a bitter seed. 17 years old, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small, coarse sack clutched in her hand, Anya stood where the dusty track of civilization gave way to the indifferent stone of the mountains. Inside the sack was a small earthenware crock, cool to the touch, and inside that, a fist-sized lump of pale, sour-smelling dough. It was her mother's legacy, a living chain stretching back through generations, and it was the evidence of her crime. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and the coming frost. Behind her, the last lamp in the last house was extinguished, a final, silent judgment. Her uncle's voice, rough as unsanded wood, still clawed at her ears. "Thief! Using my flour for that filth. Your father's foolishness lives on in you." He had held up her father's leather-bound notebook, filled with meticulous drawings of oven chambers and notes on the strange, invisible life in the air, and declared it devil's work. The town, huddled in the pews of his certainty, had nodded in silent agreement. They looked, and they chose not to see. Now, she was alone, the weight of their scorn a physical burden on her shoulders. She faced the looming peaks, a wilderness that promised nothing but hardship, a place where people went to be forgotten. And in that moment of profound abandonment, a single, defiant question took root in the barren soil of her despair: how does a seed, thrown onto stone, learn to grow? How does a girl, cast out for the crime of keeping a memory alive, build a world from nothing? If you've ever felt the sting of being misunderstood, of having your passion treated as a fault, then stay with me. This is the story of how the most desolate beginning can lead to the most extraordinary harvest. It had always been about the bread. Her life was measured not in years, but in the rhythmic cycle of feeding the starter, of mixing, kneading, rising, and baking. Her memories of her mother were not of lullabies, but of the whisper of flour being sifted, the warmth of her hands guiding Anya's own clumsy fingers in the dough. "It's alive, little bird," her mother would say, her voice soft as a dusting of flour. "It breathes. It feels the warmth and the cold. You must listen to it." Her father, a man whose hands were as comfortable with a pen as they were with a shovel, saw the science beneath the ritual. He was a quiet observer, a student of the world who filled notebooks with his findings. He sketched the delicate lattice of gluten, wrote about the wild yeasts that floated in the very air of their small cabin, invisible spirits that could be coaxed into service. He explained the physics of heat, how it traveled through stone, how the steam released from the dough was what gave the crust its perfect, shattering crackle. To him, it wasn't magic, it was a beautiful, predictable dance of elements. Her uncle Theron, her mother's brother, had always watched them with a pinched, sour expression. He was a man of brute force and simple truths. He saw the world in black and white, good and bad, practical and useless. To him, bread was flour, water, salt. Nothing more. The starter was a needless complication. The notebooks were blasphemy. "Your daddy filled your head with foolishness, and I won't have it poisoning this house," he had grumbled 100 times, even when her parents were alive. After the fever took them, swift and merciless, leaving Anya an orphan in his care, his grumbling turned to doctrine. He saw her devotion to her parents' craft not as remembrance, but as rebellion. The final confrontation had been over a few handfuls of flour. He kept his supply locked in a bin, doling it out with a miser's hand. She had taken just enough to feed the starter, to keep that living piece of her mother from starving. He caught her, the small crock in her hands, and his rage, simmering for years, had finally boiled over. He called it theft. But Anya knew what it truly was. He was trying to erase her parents, to scrub their memory from the world by killing the last living thing they had made together. He had cast her out not for stealing flour, but for refusing to forget. The first days in the mountains were a blur of cold and aching hunger. The wilderness was not the gentle, giving place from her father's books, it was a vast, unfeeling entity that sought to grind her down. The sun was a distant, pale coin in the sky, offering little warmth. The nights were a deep, terrifying black, filled with the rustles and snaps of unseen creatures. She ate bitter roots and the last of the season's tough berries, her stomach a tight, painful knot. Loneliness was a constant companion, a presence so heavy it felt like another person walking beside her, their cold hand on her shoulder. She thought of her warm bed, of the smell of stew in her uncle's house, and the temptation to crawl back, to beg for forgiveness, was a siren's call. But the memory of his face, twisted with contempt, was a stronger force. She would not give him the satisfaction of her surrender. She followed the spine of a ridge for what felt like an eternity, her worn boots scraping against granite. A storm rolled in without warning, the sky turning the color of a fresh bruise. Rain fell in icy sheets, driven by a wind that shrieked through the pines. Soaked and shivering, stumbling through the deluge, she fell, her hand scraping raw against the slick rock. She lay there, the cold seeping into her bones, and for the first time, she felt death as a real possibility, a quiet invitation to simply stop. It would be so easy to close her eyes. But then, her hand, searching for a grip, brushed against something tough and fibrous. It was a thick curtain of ancient ivy, clinging to a rock face. A primal instinct, a flicker of her father's practical curiosity, made her pull it aside. Behind it was a shadow, a void in the stone. It was a cave. Not a shallow overhang, but a true opening, leading back into the darkness. The air that breathed out from it was still and cold, but it was dry. It was shelter. It was a chance. With the last of her strength, she crawled inside, dragging the precious sack with her, and collapsed onto the dusty floor as the storm raged on outside, a world away. The cave was her sanctuary, her tomb, her entire world. When she finally awoke, the storm had passed, and a sliver of pale light filtered through the ivy, illuminating a space far larger than she had imagined. The entrance chamber was wide and tall, but it narrowed into a passage that snaked deeper into the mountain. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth, stone, and a clean, mineral scent, like the air after a lightning strike. She spent the next days exploring her new home, her bare hands her only tools. The floor was uneven, a jumble of fallen rock and packed dirt, but it was dry. The walls were solid granite, weeping in a few places but mostly impervious. Deeper inside, where the darkness was absolute, she found the cave's secret. A fissure, a natural crack in the mountain itself, ran from a high, domed chamber all the way up to the surface. She couldn't see the top, but she could feel a faint, steady draft. A chimney. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, a memory from one of his lessons. Proper ventilation is everything, Anya. The smoke must have a place to go, or it will poison you. But more than that, a good draft pulls the heat, making the fire burn hotter, cleaner. A chimney. It was a gift from the mountain itself. Here, in this hidden pocket of the earth, she could make a fire that would not betray her with a plume of smoke visible for miles. She could be a ghost. The discovery ignited a spark in the cold emptiness of her chest. This would not be a place of mere survival. This would be a place of making. She began the titanic task of shaping the cave to her will. Using a flat piece of shale, she scraped and dug, leveling a large section of the main chamber floor. She hauled out loose rocks, her muscles screaming in protest, her hands cracking and bleeding. She found a deposit of rich, grey clay by a hidden stream deep in a ravine, and she spent days carrying it back in makeshift slings made from her own clothing, her back aching with the strain. She was creating her workshop, her kitchen, her home, one painful, deliberate step at a time. In the small crock, her mother's starter was sluggish but alive. She fed it with painstakingly gathered and crushed wild grains, whispering to it as her mother once had, coaxing it back to life. It was a fragile, precious link to her past, and the center of her future. The work of building was slow and punishing, a conversation between her memory and the raw materials of the mountain. Her father's notebooks, which she had saved from her uncle's pyre by tucking them inside her shirt, were her only blueprints. She studied his drawings of ovens, the precise angles of the flue, the calculated thickness of the walls designed to absorb and hold heat for hours. He had called it a retained heat oven, a design that was efficient, that baked with a gentle, pervasive warmth rather than the harsh, direct flame of an open fire. Her first oven was a small, experimental thing, built into a niche in the cave wall. She gathered flat, dense stones from a nearby rockslide, choosing each one for its shape and size. She mixed the clay she had harvested with sand from the stream bed and tough, dried grasses to act as a binder, creating a primitive but effective mortar. Her hands were constantly caked in the gritty, cool mixture. She laid the foundation, then carefully built up the dome chamber, leaving a narrow opening for the door. She formed the flue, directing it towards the natural chimney in the ceiling. It was imperfect, lopsided, but it was hers. The first firing was a moment of terrifying hope. She built a fire inside the small chamber, feeding it with dry wood until the interior stones glowed with a faint, orange light. Then, she raked out the coals and sealed the opening with a large, flat stone. The heat, trapped within the thick walls, radiated into the small space. While it rested, she prepared her first loaf. The dough was rough, made from wild rye she had ground between two stones. It was nothing like the soft, pillowy dough from her mother's kitchen. But the starter had worked its magic, and it had risen. She slid the small, precious loaf into the hot darkness of the oven and waited. The smell, when it began to fill the cave, was so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. It was the smell of home, of safety, of a promise kept. It was the scent of creation. When she pulled it out, the crust was dark and thick, the crumb dense, but it was bread. She broke it open, the steam rising like a prayer, and the taste was one of victory. It was the taste of survival. Over the months, she perfected her craft. She built a second, much larger oven, its construction more refined. She learned the mountain's rhythms, where to find the best wood, which grains to harvest. She built shelves into the walls, long slabs of slate resting on carefully placed stone supports, and began to fill them with her loaves, a silent army standing ready in the cool, dry dark of the earth. She had been alone for nearly a year, a solitary creature living by the rhythms of the sun and her starter, when she was found. She was gathering fallen wood in a grove of aspens when a voice, cracked and dry as autumn leaves, startled her. "That's a good haul for one person." An old woman stood a dozen paces away, leaning on a long staff. She was weathered as the mountains themselves, her face a roadmap of deep lines, her eyes a startlingly bright, clear blue. She carried a pack made of animal hides and wore clothes that seemed more grown than sewn. This was Maeve, a figure of rumor in the town below, a recluse who traded rare herbs and prime furs but never stayed long enough for conversation. Anya froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had grown so used to silence that the sound of a human voice was a physical shock. Maeve showed no alarm, only a quiet, assessing curiosity. Her gaze wasn't judgmental, just observant. She saw the smudge of clay on Anya's cheek, the calluses on her hands. Her eyes flickered towards the ridge where the cave was hidden. She already knew. She had likely been watching for days. Anya said nothing, her throat tight with fear. Maeve took a slow step forward, her movements deliberate, unthreatening. "Smell of good baking carries a long way on a clear day," she said, her voice softer now. "Haven't smelled bread like that since I was a girl." Anya remained silent, poised to run, but Maeve simply sat down on a fallen log, placing her staff across her knees. She was in no hurry. She was not a threat, she was a witness. After a long silence, she spoke again. "Your mama teach you this?" Anya gave a small, jerky nod, her first communication with another soul in a year. Maeve nodded slowly in return, a deep understanding passing between them. "She teach you good." That simple affirmation, that acknowledgement of her heritage and her skill, was a key turning a lock in Anya's chest. Later, cautiously, she led the old woman to her cave. Maeve walked into the main chamber and her eyes widened, not with shock, but with profound respect. She took in the great stone ovens, the neatly stacked wood, the shelves of waiting loaves, the bubbling starter in its crock. She ran a hand over the smooth curve of the larger oven. She didn't ask how Anya had been cast out. The mountain kept its own counsel, and so did she. Instead, she unslung her pack and laid out its contents, a block of precious salt, a finely honed skinning knife, a thick wool blanket, and 2 full sacks of fine, milled wheat flour. She looked at the shelves of bread, then back at Anya. "Trade?" she asked. It wasn't charity. It was a partnership. The arrangement with Maeve changed everything. It was a bridge to a world Anya thought she had lost forever, but on her own terms. Every few weeks, Maeve would appear at the edge of the woods, a silent signal, and they would trade. Anya's dark, hearty loaves for salt, flour, dried beans, a needle and thread, news. Maeve never spoke of Anyar to the main townsfolk. She understood the fragility of Anyar's sanctuary and the long memory of a town's scorn. Instead, she became a quiet agent of distribution, a conduit for Anyar's craft to the other forgotten people of the valley. She traded the bread with the solitary prospectors who lived in shacks up the creeks, men who hadn't tasted anything but hardtack and jerky in months. She brought it to the families living on the fringes, those deemed too poor or too strange to be part of the town's tight-knit, judgmental society. For them, the bread was more than food. It was a message. It was proof that someone, somewhere, saw them. That they were not entirely alone. Anyar's bread became a rumor, a myth whispered around lonely campfires and in rundown cabins. They called it mountain bread, or sometimes ghost bread, for it appeared without a known source, delivered by the enigmatic old woman of the hills. Its reputation grew. It was dense, nourishing, with a complex, tangy flavor from the wild yeast starter and a crust that crackled like a fire. It was the taste of something real and honest in a world of subsistence and scarcity. Anyar worked tirelessly in her subterranean bakery. The influx of real flour from Maeve allowed her to experiment, to blend the wild grains with the milled wheat, creating loaves of incredible character. Her hands, once soft, were now strong and capable, mapped with the fine white scars of small burns and the deep, ingrained texture of flour. She was no longer just surviving, she was thriving. The rhythmic work of baking was a meditation. The feeding of the starter, the kneading of the dough, the patient waiting for the rise, the intense, watchful heat of the oven, it was a liturgy she performed in the heart of the mountain. She was building more than a stockpile of food, she was building a new identity, one loaf at a time. She was no longer Anyar the outcast, the thief. She was the baker. And through her quiet, hidden work, she was unknowingly weaving the first threads of a new kind of community, a communion of the marginalized, bound together by the simple, profound gift of bread. That year, winter came early and with a savage, predatory hunger. It descended from the high peaks not as a gentle blanket of snow, but as a roaring blizzard, a solid wall of white that erased the world. The storm howled for a week, piling drift so high they buried fences and reached the roofs of the town's small houses. When it finally ceased, the silence was absolute and terrifying. The pass, the town's only connection to the outside world, was completely blocked by a mountain of snow and ice. They were cut off. Trapped. At first, there was little concern. The town had supplies. But the winter did not relent. The cold was a physical presence, a beast that gnawed at the seams of every building, that leached the warmth from every fire. Weeks turned into a month, then two. The town's communal stores, managed with her Uncle Theron's characteristic lack of foresight, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. He had preached faith in tradition, in the old ways, scoffing at the notion of preparing for a winter worse than any before. His certainty, once a source of comfort for the town, now felt like a betrayal. The game in the valley grew scarce, driven into hiding by the deep snow. The preserved vegetables ran out. Then the salted meat. Soon, all that was left was the flour, and it was disappearing fast. Hunger began to stalk the small wooden houses, a gaunt, silent spectre. It hollowed the cheeks of the children and put a desperate, hunted look in the eyes of the adults. Sickness, the faithful partner of starvation, followed close behind. A dry, racking cough echoed in the frozen streets. Up in her mountain sanctuary, Anyar was safe. Her cave was insulated from the brutal cold, her great ovens providing a steady, radiant warmth. Her shelves were heavy with hundreds of loaves of bread, carefully baked and stored, a testament to her tireless work. She had more than enough to see her through the winter and beyond. Maeve arrived one afternoon, her face grim, her body cloaked in snow. She had made the perilous journey down from her own high shelter. She told Anyar of the town's plight, of the hunger, the sickness, the quiet despair that had taken hold. She spoke of Theron, his authority shattered, a man broken by the failure of his own rigid beliefs. Anyar listened, the warmth of her bakery a stark contrast to the chilling story Maeve told. She looked at her shelves, at the wealth of life-giving bread she had created. She thought of the faces of the people who had cast her out, who had watched in silence as her uncle condemned her. A bitter, cold part of her wanted to let them suffer, to let them feel the gnawing emptiness they had so easily inflicted upon her. But then she remembered her mother's hands, her father's patient voice. Bread was not a weapon. It was not a tool for vengeance. It was life. It was community. And it was meant to be shared. She looked at Maeve, her decision made. "Fire the second oven," she said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet of the cave. "We have work to do." The cave became a whirlwind of focused, relentless activity. Anya and Maeve worked in a synchronized, unspoken rhythm, a partnership forged in purpose. While one fed the great fires inside the ovens until the stones pulsed with heat, the other would be mixing enormous batches of dough in a large, hollowed-out stone basin. Anya's movements were efficient, wasting no motion as she worked the dough, her arms and shoulders burning with the familiar, satisfying ache. They baked day and night, sleeping in short shifts on piles of furs near the warmth of the cooling ovens. The air in the cave was thick with the rich, life-affirming scent of baking bread, a stark contrast to the sterile, frozen air outside. The shelves, already full, began to overflow. They stacked the loaves on every available surface, turning the cave into a catacomb of nourishment. When they had a mountain of bread, the second phase of their plan began. Under the cover of the deep, moonless nights, they would load as many loaves as they could carry into heavy sacks and make the treacherous journey down to the edge of the sleeping town. They moved like shadows, their footsteps muffled by the deep snow. They left the bread on doorsteps, on window sills, on the bench outside the silent meeting hall. They left it and vanished back into the hills before the first hint of dawn. At first, the townspeople were bewildered, then suspicious. They attributed the miracle bread to Providence, to a desperate prayer answered. But the bread was too real, too solid to be just a phantom. It was dense and dark, still faintly warm from an oven none of them could locate. It filled their empty bellies and brought a flicker of life back to their children's eyes. It was undeniably real, and it was saving them. Slowly, the town's fear gave way to a desperate, consuming curiosity. Who was their secret benefactor? A small group of the town's men, led by a weary but determined elder, decided they had to know. They waited, hidden at the edge of town, through a long, freezing night. Just before dawn, they saw them, two figures, heavily laden, emerging from the snow-shrouded trees. They followed Maeve's distinct, deep tracks back up into the foothills, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The trail led them to a place they had never known existed, a curtain of ivy on a sheer rock face. They pushed it aside and stepped into the warm, fragrant air of the cave. What they saw stunned them into silence. The soft glow of the ovens, the incredible sight of shelves laden with more bread than they had seen in their entire lives, and at the center of it all, a young woman, her face smudged with soot, her expression one of quiet, weary strength. It was Anya, the girl they had cast out. And standing with the men, at the very back, was Theron. He saw her, and his face, already etched with the shame of his failure, crumpled. His gaze fell upon an open notebook resting on a rock, its page showing a detailed diagram of the very oven that was now keeping his town from starving. He finally understood the value of the knowledge he had so long despised. He took a hesitant step forward, his voice a hoarse whisper in the sacred quiet of the bakery. "I was wrong," he said, the words heavy with the weight of a winter's worth of suffering. "I was wrong about the books." Anya looked at him, at the faces of the people who had abandoned her. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of revenge. She simply picked up a warm loaf from a cooling rack, broke it in two, and held a piece out to him. An offering. A beginning. The bread saved them. Not just from starvation, but from the brittle, cold certainty that had nearly been their undoing. The discovery of Anya's bakery marked the end of the town's long winter, in more ways than one. When the pass finally cleared in the late spring, it was a changed community that greeted the first traders. They were thinner, weathered by hardship, but their eyes held a new light, a humility born from desperation and a respect born from an undeniable truth. Anya did not return to live among them, not in the old way. The mountain was her home now. But she did not hide from them either. The path to her cave became a well-worn track. They came not with judgment, but with questions. They brought her things, metal tools, bolts of cloth, seeds for a small, terraced garden she and Maeve planted near the cave's entrance. In return, she taught them. She shared her father's knowledge, demystifying the science he had so loved. She showed them how to build their own efficient ovens, how to capture and cultivate the wild yeasts, how to understand the life in the dough. She taught them that tradition was not a fortress to hide inside, but a foundation upon which to build. The cave, once a refuge for one, became a school for all. Her story, and the story of the bread, became the new founding legend of the town, a tale told around hearths for generations to come. It was a story about resilience, about the strange and beautiful irony of how the very thing for which she was exiled became the source of their collective salvation. And here, at the end of this story, is where I must speak to you directly. Because this tale of a girl and her bread is more than just a story from a time long past. It's a map. It's a mirror. We have all, in some way, been cast out. We have all had a passion, a skill, a piece of our soul that was deemed foolish or useless by the world around us. We have all been told that our books, our unique ways of seeing and creating, are a waste of time. And we are all faced with the same choice Anya faced at the edge of that town. Do we allow that judgment to become our truth? Do we starve the most vital parts of ourselves to appease the scorn of others? Or do we, like her, carry that precious, living piece of who we are into the wilderness? Do we find our own cave, our own hidden sanctuary, and begin the slow, difficult work of building? The world will constantly try to tell you who you are and what you are worth. It will give you its flower and tell you precisely how you are permitted to use it. But your real power, your most profound magic, lies in the things that are uniquely yours. It's in your starter, that secret, inherited, or discovered passion that no one else quite understands. Your greatest work will not come from following the town's rules, but from building your own oven in the heart of your own mountain. So, I ask you, what is the gift you possess that the world has told you to abandon? What is the knowledge you hold that others have called foolishness? Find it. Protect it. Feed it. Carry it into the wild places and build a fire. You may feel that you are working in darkness, that you are utterly alone. But if you practice your craft with love and dedication, if you create something true and honest and life-giving, its warmth will eventually be felt. Its smell will carry on the wind. And one day, a starving world, a world that cast you out, may just find its way to your door, not to judge, but to learn. Not to condemn, but to finally, gratefully, be fed.